So they both went to Berkeley, and actually just took pictures. I was teaching down in Palo Alto, and it's the big fight now. So I took pictures of the beat cow signs, and I sent them to my daughter who was in France finishing college, and she said, "Rip those signs down, Dad." So anyway, the issue is we went through this whole period, and it was like shocking to me to go through it, even though I was a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And it turns out that a lot of the things to try to understand adolescence that you're taught as a parent by the media, as a parent by the books that are out there, and as a parent by your pediatrician, and I used to be in pediatrics, are basically wrong. And this was very disturbing to me. So as I was learning about this stuff myself as a father, I was kind of shocked that the myths of adolescence are believed by people not just in America, but by all over this world. So the problem is, these myths are not only misleading, but they're actually problematic because they do something to our adolescents themselves. And I know there are a lot of adolescents in the room. They do something to you that if you believe the myths, they're actually bad for you. So we're going to now outline the myths, figure out what nature has done to get ready to get this kid out, and then we're going to maybe do some other fun stuff to explore this issue. But basically, let's cover the basic myths. One of the myths that is common around the world is if you say to a group of parents, what leads to the change between an 8-year-old being the way he or she is and a 14-year-old? What do they always say? Hormones. And what are the hormones doing? They're raging, exactly. Raging hormones. Now, I was teaching in Vermont recently, and I said, I had to get a ride from up on this mountain. Anyway, the person giving me a ride was a pediatric endocrinologist. And I said to her, I got to just ask you this question. In your endocrinology studies of hormones, have you ever heard about raging hormones? She goes, there's nothing called a raging hormone. Now, hormones rise during puberty, and that has a big effect on the body for sure, but they don't rage. So the issue is if you believe you're about to get raging hormones, like I've met with people who are like, they'll have a 9-year-old at dinner, and the parents are really nervous about adolescence coming, and they go, those rigid hormones are going to come, like they're going to take over the person, like some kind of, I don't know, some kind of monster taking it over. Now, if you were an adolescent and there were adolescents in the room, how many adolescents in the room were told you're going to have raging hormones? Let's just see. Anybody? A few. Okay. So let's put ourselves in the mind of being an adolescent, or let's say being a 10-year-old where you're getting close to adolescence, and someone tells you these molecules that have anger management problems are going to invade your body. What could you do about that? Nothing. Unless you get, plasmapheresis, where they filter your blood and take out the hormones or something. There's nothing you can do. It's a disempowering thing. And fortunately, it's a complete lie. But everyone says it. Raging hormones, raging hormones. So we have to see what's the actual truth. Second myth is, the adolescent period is a period that is so horrible. It's so demonic. It is such a form of possession that will grab your child, yank her or him around, and maybe, if you're lucky, they'll come back in their 20s. So, the answer to the adolescent period being so horrible, this is all a lie, by the way. The answer is get over it as fast as possible. Those are both lies. The adolescent period is not a period where it has to be some possession thing. And it is not a period that you should get over as quickly as possible. In fact, studies suggest, and Larry Steinberg, Lawrence Steinberg's work supports this, and it's the view of the Brainstorm book, which I ended up writing because there was nothing for adolescents, so I wanted to write a book for adolescents to read about their own changes. You should actually keep your adolescence going for as long as possible. That is the healthiest thing for you and your brain. So we'll see, why am I saying that? So it's just the opposite. It isn't something you should get over. It's something about the truth of it, because you'll see it's very empowering. The third myth is that adolescence is a period where teenagers who are starting the adolescent period will basically get out of this period once they turn 20. Because teenagehood and adolescence are the same thing. And that turns out to be wrong. The adolescent period goes into the mid to late 30s. No, the mid to late 20s. The mid to late 20s, as you'll see in a moment. And finally, the final myth we'll talk about, or there's probably others we'll come up with, but the major myth is the idea that adolescents somehow have to push against all adults and just exclude them from their life. And we kind of had this kind of attitude in this country, where you kind of say, well, just let them be, just let them be. But in fact, adolescents need adults. The thing is, they need adults who aren't their birth parents, to rely on safe adults who are trustworthy figures in their lives, because we actually evolved with something called alloparenting, which basically means that there are more than just the mother and father raising this child. And we grew up in communities where you knew people who you could rely on and trust. And adolescents could find their way into the community by maintaining connections with adults, even if they were pushing against the parents who gave birth to them. So this is a bit of a problem in our society. We have teachers who are really, really busy, and we have many adults who are not trustworthy, for sure. So we're all like worried about it. And so what adolescents do is they just find each other instead of having other adults besides the parents to turn to. And that's a bit of a problem. So having mentors who are non-parental adults is just something we need to think about as we go forward in thinking about this. So those myths are just something to be aware of. Now, I'm going to now describe two things, and I'll speak directly to adolescence, about the essence of adolescence, but to do this, I've asked ahead of time if I could have some volunteers to come up and demonstrate this. So I've actually asked Ella and Kim to volunteer to come up. And first, just Ella, Kim, if you can this way. So Ella is going to come up, and I'm going to talk to you and to Ella about what goes on during adolescence, because adolescence is really the second dozen years of life, like from 12 to 24. But Ella, you are 13?
I am, yes.
Great. And do you come up here voluntarily? What I mean by that is, are your parents forcing you, or am I forcing you?
No.
No.
You're not.
Okay, good. I just want these witnesses to be aware of that. Oh, no one's up here. Okay, good. Okay, so what, did you know that there are people here listening? You can see, okay, great. Okay, so here's the deal. So, do you remember being like 8 years old?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. And would you say being 13 feels a lot different from being 8?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Can you share with us in what ways, and then we're going to build on what you say?
8 years old, I really never argued with my parents. I would just go, la 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 la.
So no arguing, just going la 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 la, meaning you get along with them. Okay.
Probably, I guess I was able to do more, not do more things, but I don't know, just more apparent.
Or what?
It's different. I mean, not different, but I don't know. I kind of yell more now.
You yell more. Okay. Now let's just check it out. Other adolescents in the room, would you say before you did the la la la, got along with your parents, but now you're yelling more? Anybody go with that? Okay. Look at all the hands. See, or you have friends there. Good. Okay. Let's move up here so we won't fall off. Okay. Great. So now let's go through. There are 4 things that research has shown that are changing in your brain and all of your fellow adolescents out there brain. Is it okay if I talk about your brain? Okay. So let's do this. You know, the schools that have sponsored me coming here have been really kind, and they came ahead of time, and they have taped with that blue tape underneath your chair a hand model of the brain that you can take home with you. So if you reach under your chair, reach under there and see if you can feel that thing there. And then pull out your hand, and you'll see attached to your wrist is a hand, and you can take it. Kim, can they take this home?
Yes.
Yes. This is your handout for the talk. So if you put your thumb in the middle of your hand, Thank you. And put your fingers over, excuse me, over the top. This would be oriented in Ella's, turn your face that way, please. This would be oriented in Ella's head like that, okay? So that's the brain, and you do it with me, so we can teach this together. Okay, so we're gonna go over the parts of the brain, because to understand what changes in adolescence, for all of you adolescents, it's crucial for you to understand the structure of your brain and how the structure of your brain relates to what happens in your mind. Now you may go, well, isn't the mind just the brain? And the answer is no, it's actually not. And I just wrote a whole entire book called Mind, showing how the mind and brain are not the same thing. But they're related to each other in that your feelings, your thoughts, even consciousness can change as your brain changes. But they're just not exactly the same thing, as you'll see soon. The second thing to say about going through this brain is that when you as an adolescent learn about how the brain works, you can use your mind, like how you focus attention, to change the activity of your brain. And when we learn about exactly what's changing in the brain, which you'll learn in a few minutes, you can learn techniques, and they're all in the Brainstorm book, for how to make your brain grow really well. So the myth of the raging hormones is disempowering. What you're about to learn is the science of using the mind to change the brain in positive ways. And just if you're like the science part, that branch of science is called neuro, N-E-U-R for neurons, neuroplasticity, and plasticity means how experience changes the structure of something. So when we say something's plastic, we're not talking about like a plastic, toy. We're talking about something being changeable by experience. That's what plastic really means. So, you ready? Okay, so let's go through the hand model of the brain. So, put your fingers together and your thumb noodle. So, if we lift up the top of the brain, that top of the brain is called the cortex, and we'll come back to it soon. The middle of the brain is where your thumb is. That's called the limbic, L-I-M-B-I-C area. Lift that up. And the deepest part of the brain is called the brain stem. And all this stuff of the brain here is, if you turn around here, in Ella's backbone, you have the spinal cord that comes up through the neck and attaches here. That would be your wrist. Okay, so the spinal cord will represent how the whole body is actually bringing signals up into your brain, where in part awareness comes from. Everybody with me so far? Okay, great. So here's the story. First of all, just to give you a teeny bit of background, this whole nervous system we're about to talk about, this is kind of wild, but when the sperm and egg get together and form a conceptus, and the conceptus is growing into an embryo, it turns out that the outer layer of that embryo is going to push inward to actually become your spinal cord. And the only reason I tell you that is that neurons are basically fancy skin cells. Now the reason I'm saying that is not that you're going to get acne on your spinal cord, but that the skin is the interface between the outside of the body world and the inside of the body world. So we need to remember that the nervous system, even though it's deep inside the body, it's all about interfacing the outer and the inner. We have to remember that. Fancy skin cells, basically, is what we're about to talk about. Okay, so the baby is growing as an embryo into a fetus, now it's a baby, it comes out, and as we mentioned, genes will have determined a lot about how the neurons grow inside the nervous system, and then you've got this three-part brain. At birth, the deepest part we're going to start with, the brainstem, has grown a lot. And this brainstem, okay, is 300 million years old. I mean, you're not 300 million years old, but you've inherited from 300 million years back in our reptilian days. Now, we are in California, so it's safe to talk about evolution, but in other states, I have to always ask, is it okay if I talk about science? Or, do you believe in science? Like climate change, or something like that. Pitch me. Ah, I'm awake, okay. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. I was here. Yes. Thank you. You're doing great. Is Nella doing great? Okay. So, here we go. Okay, so the brainstem is 300 million years old. And the deal about this brainstem is it has two big functions we're going to remember because they affect your experience as an adolescent. One is it takes care of the body, your digestion, your breathing, your heart. Just like, you know, a snake has a heart and has to breathe and all that stuff, has intestines. So that's the way to remember it. 300 million years old. Okay. Then when we evolved into mammals, we developed the second part of the brain. Put your thumb over. And most of us have just one thumb, but you have a left and right limbic area. That would be your model like that. And in this thumb area, which is 200 million years old, we call it the old mammalian part of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that is changing a lot in you as an adolescent. And the thing that's important about that is as this changing limbic area is changing with you since you're 8 to now when you're 13, we know, because at UCLA, where I work, and also at National Institute of Mental Health, we've done studies of people, like all the adolescents in the room. Every year they came in for studies up until their mid to late 20s, and we know what goes on in the brain of healthy individuals. So that's what I'm going to share with you now. But the bottom line is, this is one of the major areas that's changing. So at birth, the brainstem in your palm is pretty much completely formed. The baby comes out, let's say the limbic area is halfway formed, and the cortex is hardly formed at all. So we're going to review these 5 functions of the limbic area because each one of the 5 functions changes in ways you're going to tell me. The adolescents in the room are going to tell us, and we're going to try to remember as adults what those changes were like. But let's go through them one by one. You ready? And we may use examples if that's okay. And we may even ask your mom to come up. Is that okay? So Kim, come on up. Let's hear it for Kim. This is a mother-daughter team. Thank you, Kim. So we're going to review now the 5 functions of the limbic area because we want to understand how these changes are happening. Oh, that's great. Okay, are you ready, you two? Okay. So, number 1, the signals from the body arise up through what's called the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, don't worry about that, but they rise up through that area and through the spinal cord itself, and then up, we're going to represent it just by your wrist. And they push upward to the brainstem, which has this way you regulate the body, and also it has the reactions in the brainstem of threat, with fight, 4 Fs, fighting, fleeing, freezing, or fainting in response to helplessness. Okay, that's the brainstem response. Those signals from the body interact with the brainstem, and they come up to the limbic area to create what we call emotion. So the limbic area, the thumb, the brainstem and the palm, and all the stuff from the body, which we're going to represent as the wrist, are the source of emotion. And the research on the adolescent brain explains the following kind of experience. Do you want to share what happened the other day when you were giving a presentation to your mom?
Oh, sure. Okay. So, I was doing a presentation for school, and I was doing it for my dad and my mom to see their ideas if I should make it better. And while I was presenting on cheap, actually, I saw my mom do kind of a critical face. So I was like, Mom, why are you being so critical? She's like, I'm not being critical, but I thought she was.
Yeah. So how did that feel when you saw your mom like that?
I don't know.
Inside of you, how did it feel?
I was kind of critical of her in a way.
What did you do?
Mom, why are you being so critical?
Yeah, right.
But,
Yeah.
she was like, I'm not being critical.
But you know she was. Okay, Kim?
I thought I was listening. I was interested. I was sitting on the couch,
Hold it right.
listening. I wasn't thinking any negative thoughts, but she yelled at me. Mom! Why do you look like that? You look so disappointed or distressed.
You want to respond?
Okay. I guess, well, I thought you were being pretty close.
Okay, so that was your experience. Now, here's the thing, we'll get to what you would do about that, but here's what studies show. This limbic area, the first of the 5 functions, creates emotion, and if you compare an 8-year-old to a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old to, let's say, a 28-year-old, the stuff from the body, the brainstem, and the limbic area is much more activated in an adolescent. You know that if you just go to dinner and there's a table of adolescents and a table of adults, who looks like they're having more fun? Seriously. So the first thing we say about emotions is there's a kind of an emotional spark, which some people just call passion, in the adolescent period for reasons we're going to talk about in just a moment. But the issue here is that it's not only this emotional thing, but the second function is where the limbic area excuse me, and the brainstem actually work together to create motivation. So you're always seeing what is your behavior going to be. And the third function is something called evaluation. So the limbic area evaluates whether to pay attention to things or not, if they're important or not. And then once it's paying attention to them, this limbic area says, is this thing good or is this thing bad? And then if it's good, it responds to it saying, how do I get more? If it's bad, it responds to it saying, how do I get away from it? Right? So what this example between Ella and her mom, Kim, suggests is that Ella was having an emotional experience where there was an evaluation of a neutral face that Kim says she was showing as hostile. And that's exactly what the research shows happens in the adolescent brain. That if you take a neutral photograph and show it to an 8-year-old versus a 14-year-old versus a 28-year-old, the 14-year-old will interpret it as negative, even if it's not the mom. Isn't that amazing? So I learned that study once, and I came home, because I had 2 teenagers, and I came home, and I said, hi, and they go, why are you talking like that? I just said, hi, you're doing it again. And luckily, I just read this study, so I could have said, don't talk to me like that, young lady. And what would that have done if I did that? Huge fight, right? But instead, I understood as a parent that this is what the adolescent brain does. Now, here would be an absolutely humiliating thing. I could go to my daughter or son and say, you just have a brain that's kind of out of control, don't you? Or something like that. So that would be humiliating and nasty. But instead, I take a deep breath and say, okay, I'll try to say hello in a nicer way, or something like that. Seriously. Because each person is a differentiated person. Ella had her experience, and you weren't intentionally trying to interpret your mom's face as hostile, were you?
No.
But no.
No.
But that was your experience.
Of course.
Yeah.
Why?
Right. So this is the issue, that Ella's brain is primed for hostility. Seriously. So Ella's mom, Kim, has got to be able to give her space, because Ella is an adolescent now, and her brain is doing something called remodeling. And we'll show why that's helpful in a moment. So the fourth function of the limbic area that changes also is memory. And let me ask you something, Ella. Do you find that you're remembering things in a different kind of way than your 8?
Probably, yes, I do.
In what ways?
Well, I remember how I looked at it. I remember how I looked at it. So, say I was riding a horse, I remember how my surroundings looked like. I remember little moments.
You mean now as an adolescent?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this would be an example of autobiographical memory, where you remember yourself in time in more detail. And that's exactly what happens with adolescence, because the limbic area has a region called the hippocampus, which is going to mature and grow in some really wonderful ways. And let me ask the adolescents in the room, how many of you notice you are starting to think about who you are and your place in life and what your identity is? Raise your hand if that's something happening. So you can see, look around. That's a very natural part of adolescence to think about that. Okay, and then the fifth function of the limbic area that changes is called attachment. And what attachment is for us as mammals, is it's how we, when we're young, we rely on our caregiver, in this case, Kim and her dad, Kim and Ella's dad, although if you had grandparents there, that'd be true too. To see her mind beneath her behavior, that's what it means to be seen. To be soothed, so when you're distressed, they would soothe you. And to be safe, meaning if you're feeling frightened, you turn to them for safety, and you don't want them to terrorize you, right? And if you have those three S's, seen, soothe, and safe, you develop the fourth S called security. Now, when you're young, like when you're 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, you know, your attachment figure, the person who you have attachment to, is your mom and dad, right? For the most part, or other caregivers that took care of you. But when you become an adolescent, you start, especially when you're in need, you start turning toward who instead of your parents? Your friends, exactly. So there's a shift in the limbic area that says, I'm going to go to my friends. Okay, so those are the 5 functions. We're going to talk about them in just a minute.